Hi, so in this lecture, I just wanted to run through the concepts and context of fashion in order to give us a bit of a background to how we can start sort of studying this concept of fashion. The aim is to give you some contextual information relating to the study of fashion and also to provide an overview of historical, academic and practical contexts. So I've brought in a few sort of case studies of shows and things like that. Um, as well, it's to sort of wake us up to fashion and to provide some contextual images and quotes for reflection, um, and hopefully also signpost you to relevant literature and case studies that could be helpful in your study. As I say, it really is sort of a background to the module, and hopefully some of it is sort of just reminding you of a few areas. So for me, yeah, fashion is a beautiful and curious thing. It is very much a change maker, and I think that's why we're interested in it. We like this idea of change. We're interested in where change may go, and fashion is quite often a reflection of that change, because it becomes an informer of the times. It tells us a lot about you know ourselves. It is a great global communicator. It's always been a very global industry. From the very early days of the Great Silk Route, we've communicated through cloth and through clothing in many ways. But what I also do feel, it is destructive in its obsolescence. Fashion is and can be very destructive in the way that it makes things obsolete before the end of their sort of natural life, natural sort of physical wear. Um, but I do believe it can be transformative in its regeneration. So it can bring new ideas into being, and that is where it can help to transform things. The context I brought into in the case of this presentation is to look at an exhibition called Women, Fashion and Power, which I think brings in some interesting themes. Taking a look at how fashion resides within education, looking at Graduate Fashion Week, and within all of these bringing in, as I say, some of this academic context. Then look into a little bit more on what I call hegemonic forces, so how the body is then sort of regulated by fashion. And finally touching on some of my own research into the area of recycling and fashion production. So the exhibition Women, Fashion and Power was great in the way that it looked at how fashion was used to determine sort of mainly women's place within society, and how clothing was a reflection of this. And I like the idea that women, fashion and power is not about multiple choice. We can have all of those areas, and so also what this was a continuation of something that I've seen very much throughout my career in both sort of the practice of manufacturing fashion, but also being an academic in fashion, is how clothing is now becoming to be seen as an artifact, to be viewed very much as an object of art. And I think this is has been a change from being seen as quite a maligned and sort of a not seen as high art. It's now, its status is changing, because previously, when we saw depictions of clothing, it was very much within sort of an artistic sort of setting, or a painterly setting. But by putting clothing within the gallery in their physical form, it can change our relationship and how we view them. Still important as they're viewed, on the left-hand side here within, photographs of these representing women who were of their time, challenging preconceived notions of femininity and what women, were seen to as the norm and what they should do. Fashion has also become a response to development, quite often sort of economic development, but physical development in the form of sort of urbanization. As we see sort of cities growing, people respond to that. And within this context, and within these times, it was all about trickle-down theory. It was how quite often the lower classes, it was seen to emulate the higher classes. And then fashion became about distinction as well, so setting yourself apart. quite often, through notions of sort of different identities, but quite often through class as well. And in this way, Veblen, a sociologist writing at in the late 1800s, spoke about how dress was an expression of a pecuniary culture. It showed our status, wealth, and occupation. Because fashion has also always been about being modern or becoming modern. It's seen as a reflection of that. And within this area, we can look at interesting studies of our pre-modern, modern, and postmodern identities. There's an argument that fashion is about moving from fixed to fluid states. So, by changing our outer, does that enable our inner to become more fluid, or to question sort of certain states? And there's some very good sort of theories who write about these states. And when we look at clothing within this sort of exhibition gallery space, we can become connected to certain times, and clothing then becomes about fitting yourself within a certain time and a certain place within society. It's about how clothing as well, becomes a reflection of sort of ideology and power. So the clothing here of Margaret Thatcher is an interesting choice of colours and texture, because there is so much to explore within fashion. There aren't clearly defined rules about what it is really, and what makes something fashion, as opposed to style. But being interested in fashion, we also need to be aware of the stages in this, what we call the fashion life cycle. As I say, this can be quite destructive in the way that we speed up obsolescence, not because something necessarily physically wears out, because it psychologically no longer becomes relevant to someone. And there are many calls to actually challenge this life cycle, and actually to make it a proper life cycle, so that we move to an area of circularity in production. And that's where I think there is some of this nature of how fashion can be a regenerative force, and bringing, as we've seen typically with designers. So here we have Vivienne Westwood in the middle, and on the left an image taken from a fashion book from the 1800s. So Vivienne Westwood very much challenging in the middle, what our notions of femininity are, but then later sort of drawing on some of these styles and these ideas in her historical work. And I think that's where we get the interesting debates of the ideas to bring forward. When we look at things within a gallery setting as well, we've got this sense of, as I say, of time and of history, and of how things may have been revolutionary for the time possibly, but also picking up on, as I say, some of these cyclical trends. So deconstructing fashion in 1975 to 1985, this was still very much a trend, as we moved into the 2000s, and it still, I think, is. And so, as I say, these sort of certain trends and ideas will come back into fashion quite often in a cyclic way. And as I say, again, where it can become a transformative is where designers start questioning the impact of their clothing on something like the environment, as we see on the left-hand side, and the right-hand side, this dress from People Tree, which is looking more at the ethics and the fair trade ideas within clothing. So hopefully that's just given us a little sort of screenshot through some ideas about how clothing becomes embedded in art and becomes embedded in this narrative discussion. And now just going to have a quick look at, say something like a Graduate Fashion Week. Obviously in these times now, this had to be cancelled this year, which was a shame, because it was a gathering of all the students, all the colleges. And I put this in really as because you have your peers, you have your people who are thinking along the same lines within something like design. And many of these courses, are around helping students to come up with a collection and to follow their ideas through into a collection of clothes. And quite often what they're looking at is some of what we see as the terminologies and definitions around sort of the ideas of fashion and style. To what degree are we making a stylish piece, and what point is it a fashionable piece? And here we see that how style is defined as a type of product that has one or more specific features or characteristics that make it different from another product of the same type. So, for example, when we look at something like a coat, we've got lots of styles of coat, but we might have a trench coat, a duffel coat, which distinguishes them. But fashion is about defining these styles within a sort of defined time, and it's all relating to the prevailing sort of styles and trends at that point in time. So just to illustrate this, so yeah, something like a dress, we can have many different dresses. When we start talking about different market levels and intentions of those dresses, though, they can, they change. So the difference between the dress from John Galliano to the dress from Primark. And again, each of these will be, in fashion at a time. And that's what we saw in Graduate Fashion Week, and students all over the world will be, coming up with their own variations and definitions of what a dress is, what this product is. So say, just to count, of many different styles of dress, a coat, any one of which may be in fashion at any given time. And so for us as people interested in retail, interested in production, bringing forth new ideas, we do need to have a connection to both a product, but also how we embed that in a fashion narrative, how it becomes something that is sought after by people now, and what is it that distinguishes it. Because this debate of the extent to which style equals fashion, it is about acceptance and time, and it's argued that a style does not become fashion until it achieves some degree of consumer acceptance and will only remain fashion for the duration of its popularity. And I think part of our challenges and part of our responsibility is to extend this duration, and maybe, as I say, challenge some of these ideas of this obsolescence of fashion. And it's about presenting as well these fashion to the public. So to say time and acceptance, we recognise that fashion exists in almost every human activity. It's about this change over time. And this process of design, of determining, what will be fashion of any time, is about satisfying the needs and aspirations of the target market. But again, it's being clear in what those needs may be. But increasingly, fashion is very much about lifestyle and how people wish to live their lives and express themselves. Within retailing, within marketing, it is all about how you can link into that general zeitgeist of time, and it's about how we become detected in that, how we detect those, how we pick up on those clues and those ideas of, as I say, of what is in fashion at this moment in time. To be involved in the study of fashion is also very much to understand how fashion is adopted and recognising different theories relating to that. We've looked at this idea of emulation, of this trickle-down idea that those of the elites within society make the fashion headlines, and they make those sort of fashion trends, and that it is trickled down. But there's very much within sort of street fashion, street trends, subcultural theory, this idea of trickle up, that actually there's a reverse adoption, and we do see that within many areas. But there's also this idea of trickle across, And I put this in because, again, as retailers, we are interested in those ideas of diffusion. How is technology, as in clothes, ideas, fashion trends, how is it diffused through and adopted by various different sectors within society? So then I'm just going to touch so briefly here on hegemonic and consumerist forces. And for me, this is where we bring in the political element to fashion. It's where certain things become seen as the norm, as natural. It's how ideas and ideals are permeated by mass media to reinforce some of these ideals. It's recognizing as well there may be a dominance within certain political or economic models that then become, as I say, the norm. It's recognizing that when we are looking at consumerism, it is, generally about economic power. It's about sort of capitalist sort of notions of consumption and production. Yeah, again, that's where there is this really interesting debate about how fashion becomes a force for good rather than this sort of great monster that is eating up all our resources and then discarding them at the end. And I've put this in again, as I say, for these areas of research and these areas of academic weight and depth where we can start considering how fashion becomes about possibly the regulation of the body, and how our bodies are maybe classified and managed and disciplined and regulated by others, be this within a fashion marketing sort of context or even as simple as going into a shop and engaging with that. Because fashion again is about culture and production. It's one of the second largest industries within the world. Its global reach is enormous. There are so many different strands and linkages within its sort of chains of production and manufacture and consumption. So again, as students interested in retail, we are interested in that relationship. On the left there is this sort of interrelationship between the fashion cycle and traditional sort of adoption theory. We want to know about the processes that are involved in both manufacturing and consuming fashion, but also about how it links into this idea notion of culture, so how it represents desires and beliefs within society and these communicative powers. And from that, beginning our sort of studies into fashion and taking them into sort of postgraduate contexts, there are many sort of great studies and books out there which do become sort of quite a narrower sort of focus for fashion. So here, looking at Islamic fashion, Chinese fashion, fashion and television, men's fashion, religious life address. Again, put these in just as I say to those explorations into studies and focusing your areas a little bit more in terms of what you are really interested in. And touching on this academic research, I'm just going to make a little bit of reference to a conference that I went to it's quite some time ago now, sort of 6 years ago, but this was over in Hong Kong, and it was looking at the global politics of fashion. And what I found interesting is here, fashion studies resided very much in the School of Politics and within sort of sociology, and this quite a lot of the discussion was looking at sort of catwalk fashion, street fashion, the debates around sort of subcultural adoption, looking at cultural referencing, within marketing, within imagery, new imagery of this I suppose investigation into ideas of cultural appropriation, but of also similarities and differences between cultures in how they adopt and consume fashion. So to help us with this idea of fashion being an academic study, I put this quote in for reflection from a woman called Alison Goodrum, who I did actually have pleasure of working with for some time. It's quite an old book now, 2001. But I've carried this quote with me, and I do think for me it sort of sums up some of what I've been trying to sort of say there, and how the body is a site of cultural production and consumption, and it underpins and characterises much of the fashion industry in its anti-functionalist sentiment. So this idea about how, does fashion, how does it become anti-functionalist? How does it, no longer function as a garment? It says here the body is considered as a surface to be inscribed upon, transformed and manipulated by various hegemonic and institutional regimes. Again, I think this is where we do see how the body may be branded. It may be it's very much a physical sort of contact. It says here the body become, together with the clothes that we dress it in, become meaningful products and representations. And I think that's a key point. We're looking, hopefully, as you're studying fashion, that it is about how do we bring meaningful products into being, meaningful representations of who and aspirations, because within my research, I've always been interested in how do those representations, say, get discarded. I've followed a path pretty much since 1992 when I set up a project with Oxfam which was looking at recycling. I've always been interested in how clothes get discarded and then how they are consumed. So I've had joy in my life to have travelled widely, and this image on the left is from 1996 in Zambia when I went over there and looking at the vast amounts of second-hand clothes and just wondering what is, we're taking very much Western clothing out of context, with the logos and the brands that represent one way of being, and it was also about how the relationship between second-hand clothing and the decimation of sort of local and indigenous industries. But then looking closer at home, in Leeds, I've lived in Leeds for a very long time. I live in a student area. We're very much aware of the waste that is left behind, and also partly this link between that and retail and the high street in producing very cheap clothes. What does that say about us? I do like this quote. There's a very good book by John Harvey looking at clothes, and he says, asks the question, by wearing mass-produced clothes to become mass-produced people. Now, as I say, I think in principle that isn't so bad. It's good to be able to wear good quality clothing, and to not have to pay a fortune for it. There is this whole idea of democratic design, that actually good design should be available to all. We've seen increases in our efficiency in mass production, to the point that we are able to respond much quicker to trends and get clothing out. And I don't think there's necessarily anything inherently wrong in that, but I think there is something wrong in the way that possibly it does feed on people's anxieties and sort of having something new all the time, and that it's generating so much waste in its wake. So say interesting context, saying that's something that I've always been interested in how these the global reach of waste, but also the local. I touched on it earlier in terms of this idea of the fashion cycle, but there is very much a call to getting fashion to be more circular, that actually the waste needs to come back into the system more, or it needs to not get there in the first place. Again, there's some very interesting studies that work on from that. There are moves to be doing this. Certain companies are looking at this, and as I say, I put this in as as a strand of our retail, as something to think about. This idea of charity retail. So as I say, I've very much been involved in charity retail for a very long time, and been interested in its relationship. And so some images here from 1992, a project I set up then. And then later on in 2004, I set up a company called Ketchup Clothes, and this was always been about remodeling and recycling existing clothes. And cloth. Throughout this, it's been about education, going out into shopping centres, going into festivals, going all over, teaching people this sort of, hopefully this the joy of the joy of our waste. It's not been a particularly glamorous job. Coming up to some conclusions like this, the extent to which, how is this engagement, better than shopping? We did get into trouble with a few shopping centres in doing some of this, because actually they realised that people were then coming in, they were learning how to remodel, recut, remake their clothes, and they weren't actually then spending money. But I think there is a way of engaging, and within retail at the moment, it is very much about this experience as well now. And I think, so this is just some of my path within where I've been. And as I say, it hasn't always been accepted, and it. But this was from 2008, actually, the Alternative Fashion Week, where we were recognised as doing something a little bit different. Because when it comes to some of this research, I suppose I am a bit of a hacktivist, if that is yes, that is a word. Great writer called Otto von Busch, who's done a really good study into and practical work as well into some of this deconstruction of fashion, where he talks about hacking as a matter of dedicated and systematic curiosity, of understanding a system, reverse engineering it, finding a suitable place for intervention, plugging in and keeping the power on. Hacking is to modify and advance a system because you love it, not because you hate it. And I think that's very much where I stand within the fashion industry. I do love it for its creativity, for the people, for the energy and the ideas that can potentially go forward to change things. But it's also, there's elements which, just so frustrate me. But I like this idea of, finding those suitable places for interventions. How can we bring about, this sort of reverse engineering of a system to make it really work? Because, my fashion styles, my fashion collections have, I suppose, drawn on my own passions of gardening and of music and sort of certain styling, I suppose, and but engaging as well in some of this urban landscape. Being involved as a practitioner within academia hasn't necessarily been easy. Practice isn't really seen in the same level as writing articles and what is seen as sort of strict theoretical sort of research. But it has opened up, some great collaborations. This was a project I did with the Global Denim Project, which was interesting. And I've spent also quite a lot of time in Africa, in Tanzania, looking at, as I say, the sort of the second-hand clothing trade there. It states here how in Uganda, second-hand garments account for 81% of all clothing purchases. So again, it is a big area of interest. Looking at ideas within design, so co-design as well has been an area that I've been very interested in. So this was from a workshop that we did in Tanzania, which was looking at bringing together second-hand garments, old jeans, and combining them with traditional cloth. And the idea was to, help to sort of regenerate that the local industry. So hopefully that has provided a bit of a substitute for the lecture we were going to have, and has just, as I say, given you a little bit of sort of food for thought, some areas where I sort of see fashion residing, a little bit about me and some of my research, and as I say, some areas for debate. I do feel that the study of fashion resides in many different spheres, ideas of history, going into the gallery, exhibition spaces. And what we're looking for here is sort of changes in aesthetics and some of those social political tensions that are maybe brought about through fashion. It's about this academic study of fashion, how that becomes defined, debated and represented, and being aware of those debates, and because that's what I want to see you developing, is this critical voice and this critical angle. And I think with retail, something like retail, it is very much about the practice. It's how does it work, looking and considering how manufacturing and consumption practices are changing, and how you can do your best to see how we can adapt to prevailing trends, but also bring new trends into being. So I was thinking from this, what I would like to do as lecture tasks is maybe to select an image or a quote for further reflection and discussion within seminars, and also to have a look through the reading list on Minerva and identify a relevant text that you think will help to expand your knowledge of the subject. And then, as I say, we will discuss these at a later date. Okay, thank you.